Is America quietly creeping towards a theocracy, new laws, louder rhetoric, and a blurring the line between church and state have some sounding the alarm? Is it a real shift or just noise in the culture war? Find out what our panelists have to say in just a moment. Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists for today. First, we have with us Mr. Todd McFarland, General Counsel for the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Ms. Jennifer Woods, who's the General Counsel and Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have Mr. Andre Wong, who's the General Counsel of the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we have Mr. Vilo Weiss, who's with the Indiana Conference Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department. Glad to have all of you guys here. Looking forward to our conversation for today. You know, there's been a question regarding whether or not America is creeping towards a theocracy. You know, residents of colonial Virginia were forced to pay taxes to support the Anglican Church, whether or not they were members. Working in concert with the colonial government, the church controlled people's lives and imposed laws requiring even church attendance. Other colonies and European countries had similar laws that were funding their dominant religion and enforcing its beliefs on citizens. Church and state were twisted together. Aware of the political power churches held over citizens, our nation's founders deliberately framed our Constitution to separate government from religion. Even the first sentence of the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. You know, Jennifer, we've probably been quoting that part of the First Amendment for quite some time. It seemed like it really kind of set the stage to make clear that we should have this separation. But America seems to be moving in a different direction. Some say that we're creeping towards a theocracy. Others say that we are actually in a full sprint. You know, what are we doing here? And is this going in the right direction? Or maybe this is just an overstatement based on what's going on today?
You know, Orland, as I look at things, I think it's important to reiterate, you know, our Constitution and the Bill of Rights, it does have this language as far as, you know, the Establishment Clause prohibiting the government from establishing or endorsing religion and giving free exercise rights to individuals. But what I'm seeing, and I think what many are concerned about, is how that's being interpreted, right? How that's being interpreted by the courts, how states are some states are pushing the limits of what does it mean to violate the Establishment Clause? What does the Establishment Clause actually require government to do regarding its interaction with religion? And so we're seeing this in the context of, you know, public schools, for example, in promoting religion in public school classrooms, having the Ten Commandments posted, having Bibles in the classroom. We're seeing this in other areas as well, and I think that's what's causing pause. And we're seeing the Supreme Court reinterpreting, in some ways, what the Establishment Clause means, right? When is there a violation? When is the government endorsing religion in a way that it's not supposed to? And I think that this is going to be a debate that we continue to see, especially in the courts.
Vilo, when you see this happening, what does it to your mind lead to? Do we find ourselves in a situation where, what's the matter with having a little church and state combined together? I mean, you've got political candidates that are even running on the fact that that should take place. I mean, what are your thoughts as it relates to this?
It's concerning to me, but you know, when I go back and look at the First Amendment, you know, it says Congress. It doesn't say some state legislature. And so, you know, George Washington and company were fine with no national establishment, but fine with local establishments. And Jefferson and Madison didn't want either. And so, you know, that tension is probably still there. And I think we are accelerating toward theocracy. And in fact, you know, you look at the Christian nationalism movement. You know, they're very clear that they were behind, particularly the New Apostolic Reformation. They were very much behind what happened on January 6, 2021. And so, we see this acceleration. Albert Mohler from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary says you can't divorce our country from God. So we are just in a full sprint, as you said, Orland.
Andre, what's interesting is, I've kind of had in my mind, I'm not really sure if you want a separation of what I would call religion and government. I kind of understand church and state, but religion and government seem like you can't separate it. You got tax issues that come into play. You've got other questions regarding, transparency issues. On some hand, maybe we really can't have a separation of church and state because government and religion are too connected.
Yeah, I mean, and I think all of us agree that there is a nexus, there is a connection, but is there a shift happening? And going to Jennifer's point, religion is being used more explicitly in political messaging more than any other time in recent decades. And lawmakers are drafting legislation not just informed by their personal faith, which is unavoidable, but openly justified by it. When government actors are saying that they're implementing God's law, not the people's law, that raises classic constitutional red flags. That's the type of language that makes separation of church and state, very, very tenuous. But on the other hand, we need to remember, loud rhetoric isn't the same as systemic transformation. America is not just one election or one governor or one viral sermon away from being theocracy. Our constitutional framework, in my opinion, is tough to bend that far. And courts continue to remain skeptical of explicit religious mandates. So, states differ wildly in their approaches. And so, in other words, yes, the temperature is hotter, debates are louder, and some politicians are pushing the envelope farther. But that does not automatically mean we're on a one-way road to a church-run state.
Todd, some may wonder, well, what's the downside to creeping in this direction? If it's just a creep and you never get all the way there, is it really a problem? Or is it a bigger concern that once you start down a road, that creep sometimes becomes a slippery slope, and then trying to go back the other way may be a little bit difficult? Or am I overstating it?
Or I think the challenge is staying in the middle, right? So if you look at the Supreme Court's jurisprudence from the 70s and sort of early 80s on Establishment Clause, it was taking things to such an extreme that it was almost unbelievable that our founders would have met this, right? That there would not be almost any reference to God or religion in public sphere, public life. A perfect example of sort of this extreme view was a few years ago, an organization, the American Humanist Society, wanted to tear down a World War I era monument to World War I veterans because it was in the form of a Christian cross, right? And it was, it had been sitting there for 100 years or so in Prince George's County here in Maryland. Fortunately, the Supreme Court ruled against them. But that, allowing there to be a cross memorializing people from war, which is a long-standing tradition, that doesn't mean you're going to have a theocracy the next day. So I do feel like a lot on the left had sort of gotten used to this idea of just not having to encounter religion or being able to sort of force a humanist secularism on broader society and are now overreacting. Now, are there some individuals on the right who probably would like to see the Ten Commandments enforced by law, or which some of them are, of course, but some of the ones that aren't? Then absolutely. But I do think there's a lot of overheated rhetoric on this, and I think to some extent it's simply sort of bringing this swing back into where it should be, because we should be able to memorialize our dead and use common symbols for that. And that doesn't mean we're forcing, religion on any particular person.
Jennifer, what's kind of confusing to me is there's kind of this conversation about the religious right. And it seems to me that there's very much a religious left. I mean, there's some clear religious organizations that you don't have to guess where they're voting, who they're supporting, and vice versa. And so when I see these type of issues regarding creep into a theocracy, it doesn't feel like it's just one side of the aisle. It seems like both sides would like to creep where they're comfortable and where it works in their benefit, but it's not necessarily a left versus a right thing. I think sometimes it's just an issue and whatever's happening in the tenor of politics in that particular year.
No, I agree. And I think that, what Todd said, I want to kind of reiterate, right? We want balance. And what we end up seeing is that it swings one way or the other, and we don't seem to get to this middle ground of balance. And I find it interesting that in this time that we're seeing more leeway with what the Establishment Clause means and people trying to push certain agendas, it's also a time that we're seeing Americans as more secular, less religious. And I think in many ways it is this pushback against that, right? People are concerned. And I think that there's this feeling of, we need to bring religion back to the forefront. And again, it's always this push and pull, when really what we need is balance. And I think that, we do have the First Amendment there. We do have our laws in place, which again give us some grounding as far as, some guidelines and some guardrails regarding the interplay of religion and people's rights and the government interplay and all of that. But again, it's this reinterpretation. I think that we're going to continue to see things being reinterpreted as people are scared that religion is declining or that secularism is taking over. And we see this taking place in various states depending on which way the state leans, right? If they're going to be promoting, which agenda they're going to be promoting.
Vilo, I saw something interesting. I was doing some meetings in Canada, and they were talking about that Canadians are going to church a lot less because they think that's being more American. The viewpoint is that being more religious feels like an American trait, and therefore some of them are feeling, I want to be anti-American, which means I've got to be anti-religion. And so the interesting thing is, even internationally, it's viewed that this theocracy is kind of moving forward. And I was kind of surprised to see that, some people are saying, I don't want religion because I'm pushing back against being more American.
Well, that's interesting because, there's some really good evidence out there that religion isn't playing a role in the lives of many people. Millions of people have stopped going to church. Jake Metter wrote about that in the Atlantic, and other surveys have shown that the amount of those people claiming to be Christian is decreasing in our culture. And so I think we're seeing a reaction to that. And, they want to go back to the good old days when the teacher could pray in the classroom and the Bible could be read, and they figured that would solve all of our ills. It didn't solve any ills, really.
Well, Andre, when I take a look at what's going on here, I have to ask myself, where does this end? Is this creep really just a creep, or is it really this is where we're going to be heading till we hit the wall?
Yeah, what we're really seeing is a battle over national identity, over whose values really get to define public life. And, on one side, you have those reclaiming religious language and politics as a way to re-anchor society, right, in a moral certainty. And on the other side, they say it's a slow erosion of our pluralism, the sense that government should belong equally to believers and non-believers, Christians and non-Christians. And the twist is that both sides think they're defending freedom.
Yeah, we have to let that be the last word, and that's the irony of all of this. Everybody, for some reason, thinks that they're right. Coming up, the Jewish community experiences anti-Semitic pushback when they request to build a synagogue on their HOA's land. Don't go away, we'll be right back. When faith and government collide, the issues can be complex and consequential. Faith in Politics explores how religious conviction intersects with law, policy, and public life, offering depth, balance, and clarity with meaningful discussion and trusted insight. To see a bunch of our previous episodes, check us out at faithandpolitics.tv and subscribe to us on YouTube. There's a case that's called Chabad Israeli Center, Inc. versus Loggers Run, Inc. For 4 years, Rabbi Herzl and his family have lived in this West Boca Raton community of Loggers Run without any issues with their HOA. But a few years ago, when the Herzls approached the HOA board about acquiring land within the HOA to build a larger synagogue to serve the local Jewish community. Although the congregation had been able to meet in a small storefront Shabbat location for services at Rabbi Herzl's home and for other events, the size of these existing venues often limits the congregation. Thus, the Herzls hoped to acquire land to build a permanent meeting location that could more easily accommodate the number of congregants that they serve in a central location. Andre, this just seems to be kind of interesting because we see a lot of these type of cases where everything's all well and fine till you decide you want to get a little bit bigger. We've got no problem with who you are till we finally realize who you really are. And then once we come to that conclusion, all of a sudden, no, pump the brakes, can't move forward anymore. We're seeing these type of cases come on a regular basis now. Churches being barred, pushed back, slowing down all of the licensing, the permitting process. This seems to be a clear violation of really trying to really pump the brakes on size of religion and sometimes even stamping them out of a community completely.
Yeah, if you've ever lived in a neighborhood with an HOA, you know the drill. They tell you the color of your garden hose or the height of your mailbox. But according to this lawsuit, the HOA didn't just enforce rules; they enforced them selectively, and in ways that seem to target this one family because they're Jewish. What this case really shows is that religious discrimination doesn't only just happen in the hands of government. It can happen in your neighborhood. It can happen in private associations that hold really enormous power to shape everyday life. Who can hold a prayer meeting or in this case, a small worship space, or who can gather peacefully, in a living room. But I think that the point is the First Amendment doesn't stop homeowners associations because they're private, but the Fair Housing Act does. And the judge in this case ruled that the Herzl family has presented enough facts for their lawsuit to move forward, and I think that that's significant here. It sends the message that religious minorities and especially religious Jewish communities don't lose their rights at the HOA gate. So if you harass, intimidate, discriminate people because of their faith, federal law has something to say about it.
Todd, what do we do when we start seeing things like this happening? We hope that from a religious organizational standpoint, you can move forward and people will understand that you're just part of the community. But it seems like we're just in a world where there's never going to be any what I would call transparency regarding what thoughts are, or you just got to deal with who's there and then get punished by having to go through the legal process.
Well, Orland, first of all, HOAs are the bane of a lot of people's existence. And the number of cases out there where HOAs have just been mini tyrants are legendary. And unfortunately, they have not limited themselves, or I should say fortunately, I'm not sure which. It's not just religious discrimination. It's not just Jewish people they hate. It seems to be almost everybody that isn't part of the in crowd that shows up. But as Andre said, there are laws protecting certain groups, and when that dislike goes to a religious group, then I think a federal lawsuit is what's in place. And hopefully this kind of action will discourage HOAs from doing the wrong thing, and the personal liability that can come with the Fair Housing Act can make a difference. One of the things they tried to argue was that, under Florida law, board members can't be personally liable. Well, Florida law doesn't trump the Fair Housing Act, right? And so, that's, I think, an important component, because otherwise board members are like, well, it may not be my problem. The HOA or the HOA's insurance will pick this up, or ultimately the people that are part of the HOA will have to pay for it, right? So having that personal liability is an important part. And, these do tend to seem to be fairly rare as far as Fair Housing Act claims on religion. And so hopefully most HOAs out there are doing the right thing.
Well, what's interesting with this whole HOA situation is the fact that most people who are part of HOAs have no idea that they could be in a situation where decisions being made where they may personally be liable. And it almost makes me wonder, is enough valid information going out there? Viola, what are your thoughts when we think about it from that standpoint?
Well, that's really scary to me, because you have loose cannons in some way that are leading these things, and in fact, like in this particular case, one of the managers told them that they should have been ended back during the Nazi period. My word. I'm glad that the Nazis went down in World War II, but some of the ideas haven't. So yeah, I think maybe this might encourage homeowner association or members of those homeowner associations to hurt a little bit more on their leaders, because they could really hurt them significantly.
Well, Andre, I have to confess, I have to drive past the president of my HOA every time I go home, and it's only the love of Christ that constrains me from wanting to throw something out the window, because, it seems as though they've gotten to the point where they almost feel like they're a government organization, that they are past anything local or federal, and at some point it makes me wonder, should there be some type of aspect of the law that really now starts to inform HOA members, this is what happens when you go too far, because you may find yourself involved in things you never thought you'd be responsible for. Like, I'm curious how many people actually knew this was happening in that association.
Yeah, and I think in this case, HOAs everywhere are watching, because if the Herzls win, it reinforces the powerful idea. Religious freedom includes freedom to worship in your home, in your neighborhood, without being singled out for punishment.
And maybe, this case, depending on how it turns out, will encourage people to be more involved in their HOAs. I mean, I too, I think I've attended one meeting, and I put it on my calendar. I don't go. I don't know what's going on. And I don't know if those who are involved know their legal responsibilities, and the laws that they have to abide by when they are keeping the community in order. But hopefully this will at least put it on people's radars that, hey, even though we're not a government entity, we still have laws that we have to abide by, and discrimination is not okay.
Orla, I don't want to turn this into the anti-HOA program, but it does remind me a few years ago, my organization I work for was involved in some litigation dealing with government access over some property. And the judge had ordered everyone else that could be impacted by this to participate in the case. Almost every other defendant was just taking a very backseat approach, not doing something. The attorney for the HOA was billing that case like his kids' college tuition depended upon it. And I used to work in private practice. I manage lawyers all the time, and I'm like, there is no reason for you to be this active in this case. But he was just soaking that HOA for everything it was worth. And I suspect the poor HOA, leadership probably had no idea what was going on and thought they were being well represented.
Jennifer, what really struck me here was not just the fact that they would say, we're going to bar this from all groups, but they actually allowed Christian groups to buy land, and in some instances even gifted them the land to be able to actually go out and build their churches. So it wasn't even like there was even a valid argument that we've got an issue just with religious organizations. It's like we got a specific problem with your religious organization, and that just seemed to be so outrageous.
Yeah, I mean, based on the information, the discrimination was pretty flagrant, right? Between the comments that were made, between the treatment of the Jewish community versus the Christian community. I mean, I think it's really hard for the HOA to say that they were in any way not basing their decisions and their treatment of this family because of their religion and their ethnicity here in this case.
One thing I wonder, Vilo, is how do we go about informing individuals that you have certain rights, even when people push back? Sometimes I wonder if this is not enough work that's being done by all religious groups. Should this be something where everybody is basically saying injustice for one religious group is injustice for all religious groups? But sometimes we seem to stand on the sidelines. In other words, where was the Christian group that had been gifted land in this whole dialogue? And it seems that was really a missing point here.
We all are in this thing together. And so we need to look out for each other, because if the Jewish rights are hindered, are limited, then all of our rights are going to be. And so, I would hope, I didn't see anything about the Christian church standing up for them, but, they should have.
In all fairness, First Liberty is representing the Jewish organization, and while it represents all individuals, I know a number of their leadership, and I assure you they are very Christian. So, Christians are. I don't know if First Liberty would describe itself as a Christian organization. I think it describes as a religious liberty organization. But the leadership there is absolutely Christian, and they are taking the lead on this case, which, by the way, is set for trial right now in the fall of 2026.
Well, you know, Andre, I think one of the things that's important when we take a look at this is just the aspect of, you know, you do this kind of work on a regular basis where it's so important for religious groups to partner together when you're battling these legal business issues that come up. And I'm sure you've been down this road before, but I bet our audience doesn't even realize how important it is to work together, that very rarely do we operate in a silo.
Yeah, you know, and as Jennifer pointed out about being involved in your HOA or your school board or whatever organization you're part of in your civic life, the world is run by those that show up. And if you want to have a voice, you know, show up. And you know, I mean, it's funny how whenever our homeowners association elections come up, I'll be walking the dog down the street and someone will come out and say, "Hey, do you want to run for X?" And I'll show up to my HOA meetings just to make sure that I don't get elected to X. But you know, really the big picture really is, I'm going to come back to this, is that the headline isn't that religious freedom isn't just a government issue. It's in our towns, our cul-de-sacs, our community centers, and sometimes protecting it means standing up to the very people in our HOAs.
Well, I'm gonna let that be the last word, but I think the idea of understanding that we have to pull together as a group all different religious denominations to really, you know, kind of row in the same direction is the only really, you know, victory that we can have together as it relates to protecting religious freedom. Hey, Todd, tell me something I don't know.
The Bladensburg Peace Cross that I made reference to in the first segment, after their win in the Supreme Court in 2019, they were then able to start restoring it. In November of 2022, they had an unveiling ceremony. It has been restored for the next 100 years and has a nice garden around it and should be there as a memorial to those who served in the Great War.
Wow, good to hear. Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Yeah, going back to the first segment when we talked about America drifting toward a theocracy, did you know that there's still a handful of countries that are considered theocracies today?
Didn't know that. Andre, tell me something I don't know.
According to the National Association of Parliamentarians, because of the cantankerous nature of their meetings, the organizations that most frequently hire parliamentarians to run their meetings are homeowners associations.
Not surprised. Vilo, tell me something I don't know.
Tim Dunn, a billionaire oil man from Midland, Texas, wants to build Christian schools in every county in America.
Wow, hadn't heard that. Well, great talking with you guys today. As usual, a lot of fun. And thanks again for you being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.